What if I told you that the United States government once decided, deliberately, in writing, after consulting its own scientists, to poison the American liquor supply? Not contaminate it accidentally, not allow it to become dangerous through neglect, poison it, intentionally, with compounds specifically chosen because they could not be removed through redistillation, with concentrations calibrated in internal federal memos based on what dose would prove lethal. And what if I told you that the officials who designed this policy knew it would kill civilians, were told by doctors and toxicologists that it would kill civilians, watched it kill civilians, and defended it publicly anyway, and that not one of them ever faced a single day of criminal accountability? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a federal policy. It is documented in Treasury Department memos, in congressional testimony, in the records of the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. It is a policy that killed a conservatively estimated 10,000 Americans, with some researchers putting the number closer to 50,000. They were killed at Christmas parties and in boarding houses and in the kinds of places where working people go when they need a few hours of relief. They were overwhelmingly poor. They were immigrants. They were Black Americans. They were the people least likely to be able to afford a safer product, least likely to have their deaths properly investigated, and most likely to have their names written in a ledger and forgotten. And for 90 years, this story was buried, not in secret files, not in classified archives, in plain sight in language so bureaucratic and technical that the ordinary reader would slide right past it, buried in the Federal Register in dry regulatory language about compound specifications, buried in the general chaos of Prohibition-era history, submerged beneath the entertaining story of speakeasies and jazz and Al Capone. Buried by a culture that prefers its government's crimes to be accidental. The version you were taught is that Prohibition was a failed experiment, a noble try that backfired, that the deaths were a tragic side effect of the bootleg economy. The version the documents tell is different. The version the documents tell is that the deaths were the strategy. This is hidden history. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm actively buries this kind of content, and there is a lot more where this came from. Let's go back to the morning the policy was already waiting. Event 1, the bootleg economy, 1920-1924. It is the morning of January 17, 1920. Across America, the saloons are closing their doors for the last time. Some of them do it with ceremony, a final round on the house, a toast to what is ending, the slow dimming of lights that have burned every night for 20 or 30 years. Some of them do it in silence, the proprietors standing behind their bars in the cold early morning after the midnight deadline, looking at the shelves. In Washington, D.C., Wayne Wheeler is almost certainly not sleeping. Wheeler is the general counsel of the Anti-Saloon League, the most effective political lobbyist in American history, and the man more responsible than any other single person for the passage of the 18th Amendment. He has spent 2 decades building toward this morning. He is 52 years old, and he has won. What Wheeler has also done, though he does not yet understand this fully, is build a market. He has taken a commodity that 105 million Americans consume in varying quantities and removed all legal means of obtaining it. The demand does not disappear. Demand this fundamental for alcohol, for the specific social and physiological experience of alcohol, for the rituals of drinking that are woven through every immigrant community and every social class in America, does not evaporate because a constitutional amendment declares it illegal. It goes underground. And going underground, it immediately creates an economy of supply. The supply side of the bootleg economy organizes with astonishing speed. Within months of the amendment taking effect, networks of illegal production and distribution are functioning in every major American city. Former saloon owners become speakeasy operators. Former bar workers become bootleggers. Criminal organizations that previously specialized in gambling and prostitution expand into alcohol distribution, and they do so with the kind of business-like efficiency that any large, stable demand inspires in entrepreneurs who are not overly concerned with the law. The product these networks sell comes from several sources. Some of it is genuine, whiskey distilled from grain, beer brewed from malt, wine produced from grapes, all of it made in secret and sold through trusted channels. This product is expensive. It takes time to make, it requires significant capital investment, and the risk of production means that suppliers charge accordingly. In the speakeasies that serve wealthy New Yorkers and Chicago businessmen and the professional class of every American city, this is what flows. The quality is inconsistent. Without regulatory oversight, there is no mechanism for ensuring that what is labeled rye whiskey is actually rye whiskey, but it is, broadly speaking, safe to drink. For the working poor, the immigrants crowded into tenement neighborhoods, the factory workers and dock workers and domestic servants who constitute the majority of the American drinking public, the premium product is not available. What is available is cheaper, faster, and more dangerous. What is available is industrial alcohol. Industrial ethanol has been manufactured in the United States since the mid-19th century. It is chemically identical to drinking alcohol at the molecular level, the same compound, the same structure, the same base. It is produced in enormous quantities for industrial purposes, as a solvent in paint and varnish production, as a fuel additive, as a raw material in chemical synthesis. Under the Volstead Act, which implements the 18th Amendment, industrial alcohol is entirely legal to produce, sell, and transport. The exemption is logical on its face. Industry genuinely needs ethanol. Shutting down industrial production would be economically catastrophic, so the exemption is written in and a loophole opens that will swallow thousands of lives. The loophole works like this. Industrial alcohol leaves the factory legally. It travels to a warehouse, a distribution point, a transfer facility. Somewhere along that chain, a bootlegger, sometimes through bribery, sometimes through theft, sometimes through the establishment of fraudulent chemical businesses that purchase the product legally, diverts the supply. He brings it to a clandestine operation, redistills it to remove some of the added impurities that have been introduced to market as industrial, blends it with water and artificial flavoring agents, bottles it, and sells it as whiskey or gin or whatever the market demands. The product is terrible. It tastes like what it is, industrial chemical with a dressing of artificial flavor, but it is available and it is cheap. And in a country where every legal alternative has been removed, cheap and available covers a lot of sins. The Federal Prohibition Bureau, the agency tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act, is from its first day a catastrophe of underfunding and corruption. The Bureau has approximately 1,500 agents in 1920. They are paid less than municipal street sweepers. They have no civil service protection. They are political appointments, hired and fired with the changing of administrations, subject to pressure from local bosses, and almost uniformly available for purchase by the organizations they are supposed to police. Within 2 years, the Bureau has become a running joke in the cities it supposedly polices. Agents accept bribes. Agents tip off raids in advance. Agents work directly for the bootlegging networks they are nominally investigating. The historian Michael Lerner later estimates that the Prohibition Bureau achieves something close to the worst enforcement record of any major federal agency in American history. Into this enforcement vacuum steps the Treasury Department, and specifically the man who runs it, Andrew Mellon. Mellon is, in 1920, one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest private citizens in the United States. He is a former Pittsburgh banker, the founder of what will become Gulf Oil and the Aluminum Company of America, a man whose fortune is so enormous and so diversified that when he is confirmed as Treasury Secretary under President Harding, he has to divest from dozens of companies to avoid the most egregious conflicts of interest, and even then, the conflicts run through the industrial economy like water through bedrock. Mellon's industrial companies use denatured alcohol. His chemical suppliers produce it. His understanding of what the denaturation program is and how it works is not theoretical. Mellon is not, by temperament or social experience, a man who worries about the deaths of poor drinkers in the tenements of the Lower East Side. His social world drinks from pre-Prohibition reserves and from the high-quality bootleg supply that serves the wealthy. He knows the scale of the diversion problem in the industrial alcohol supply. He knows that bootleggers are siphoning millions of gallons per year. And he knows that the Treasury has a tool available, the denaturation formulas that govern what compounds must be added to industrial alcohol to render it undrinkable, that could, in theory, be used to fight back. All that is needed is the will to escalate, and Wayne Wheeler is ready to provide that will. The death toll of the bootleg economy in its early years, 1920 through 1924, is not zero, but it is not yet catastrophic. Redistillation removes enough of the standard denaturing compounds to produce something that, while far from safe, does not kill immediately in moderate quantities. The deaths that occur during this period are largely attributable to careless redistillation, the introduction of contaminating compounds through improper equipment, and the occasional bottle of something produced entirely without redistillation from raw industrial supply. Bad things happen, people die, but the machinery of mass death has not yet been fully constructed. It is under construction. The men building it are in their offices. They have their formulas, their regulatory apparatus, their theory of deterrence. They are waiting for the permission that Wheeler is already in the process of arranging. The scale of the diversion is staggering. By 1922, the Federal Prohibition Bureau estimates that bootleggers are diverting industrial alcohol at a rate exceeding 60 million gallons annually. To understand what 60 million gallons means in practice, consider that it represents a substantial fraction of all the industrial ethanol produced in the United States in a given year, redirected from paint factories and chemical manufacturers into basement redistilleries and then into bottles labeled with fake brand names. The Treasury Department can see this happening. Its revenue agents track the industrial permits. They watch the volumes move. They know where the product ends up. And they are running out of enforcement strategies. The Prohibition Bureau is not merely underfunded and corrupt. It is structurally incapable of winning the enforcement battle it is being asked to fight. The country is too large. The market is too profitable. The legal system is too slow. Federal prosecutions of bootleggers are laborious, expensive, and only modestly deterrent. The penalty structures for bootlegging convictions are not severe enough to overcome the economic logic of a trade where the profit margins are extraordinary. Put a bootlegger in prison and his operation continues, run by his brother or his lieutenant or a competitor who absorbs his territory. The Prohibition Bureau understands this, and the men who run it are looking for a different kind of lever. The lever they find is not more agents, it is not longer sentences, it is not better intelligence. The lever they find is already in the supply chain, already legal, already under the Treasury's direct control. It is the formula. The bootleg economy is not the story, it is the permission structure. It is the context that makes what follows possible, the argument that something must be done, without which the policy that follows cannot be justified. The dead of the early Prohibition years are not victims of a deliberate strategy yet. They are the evidence that will be used to argue that a deliberate strategy is necessary. That argument is about to be made, and it is about to kill on a scale that the early years do not approach. Event 2, the Denaturation Order, 1906-1926. The word denaturation comes from the Latin root for against nature, and in the chemistry of alcohol, it means exactly what it sounds like. Alcohol that has been made unnatural, unfit for its natural human purpose, rendered something other than what it essentially is. The concept has a long regulatory history. Germany developed denatured alcohol programs in the 19th century to allow industrial use of ethanol without the consumer taxes levied on drinking alcohol. The United States adopted a version of the framework through the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which permitted manufacturers to sell industrial alcohol tax-free, provided that it had been rendered undrinkable through the addition of approved chemical compounds. Before Prohibition, the list of approved denaturing compounds is maintained by the Treasury Department and administered with something approximating good faith. The compounds added to industrial alcohol make it taste bad. Some of them, methanol in particular, are toxic in large quantities. But the concentrations are low enough and the compounds sufficiently removable through standard redistillation that the system functions as a rough deterrent against casual consumption rather than as a weapon against deliberate redistillation. The system is not designed to kill, it is designed to discourage. Then Prohibition begins and the commercial incentive to redistill the industrial supply becomes enormous. The profits available in bootleg alcohol are extraordinary. a bootlegger who can purchase industrial ethanol at the regulated industrial price, already low because of the tax exemption, and convert it into saleable liquor, stands to make margins that no legitimate business of the era can approach. The economics are so compelling that they produce rapid investment in redistillation technology. Within 2 years of Prohibition's start, the bootleg industry has access to distillation equipment sophisticated enough to remove the standard denaturing compounds from industrial alcohol effectively. The standard formulas are, by 1922, not doing the job the Treasury wants them to do. Senior officials at the Treasury and in the Prohibition Bureau begin, sometime around 1922 and 1923, to discuss revision. The discussions are not entirely public, they happen in meetings and in internal correspondence, but their broad outlines are recoverable from the documentary record. The argument for escalation is straightforward. If the current formula is not deterring redistillation, make the formula more difficult to remediate. Add compounds that resist the standard redistillation process. Add compounds that cannot be easily identified by smell or taste in the finished product, so that consumers do not self-select away from the contaminated supply. Add compounds that are lethal at low doses, so that even small quantities of remaining contaminant produce severe consequences. The man who applies the most direct external pressure for this escalation is Wayne Wheeler. Wheeler's role in this phase of the story is worth understanding clearly because it is easy to mischaracterize. Wheeler is not a government official. He holds no regulatory authority. He cannot issue orders to the Treasury Department. What he can do and what he does relentlessly through the extraordinary political network the Anti-Saloon leg has built is make it politically costly for government officials to resist. Wheeler's organization contributed to the electoral victories or defeats of dozens of senators and representatives. His endorsement or his opposition can determine the outcome of a primary. When Wheeler calls for escalation of the denaturation formula, senior Treasury officials understand that they are hearing from someone whose institutional power dwarfs their own. Wheeler's position on the question of casualties is explicit. It is not buried in private correspondence. Wheeler says in public that people who die from drinking poisoned industrial alcohol have made a choice that led to their deaths, and that the government bears no responsibility for the consequences of illegal behavior. He compares it, and this comparison appears in multiple sources from the period, to a burglar who falls through a skylight while committing a robbery. The homeowner did not invite the burglar. The homeowner did not push the burglar chose to be there. Wheeler's position is that the drinker chose to consume industrial product and the drinker's death is the drinker's fault. This position is not a legal defense constructed after deaths have occurred. It is stated in advance. Wheeler knows people will die. He has thought about it. He has decided it is acceptable. The Treasury Department's internal scientists are less sanguine. Some of them understand that what is being proposed is a significant departure from the original purpose of the denaturation program, from discouraging casual consumption to actively poisoning deliberate consumers. The internal debates are not well preserved. Government agencies do not, as a rule, archive the objections of their dissenting employees, but the objections were real, and some of them survive through external sources. Dr. Harvey Wiley, the food safety pioneer who engineered the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, and who had spent his career arguing for the right of Americans to know what was in their food and drink, is no longer in government by the mid-1920s, but he is alive, publishing, and furious. Wiley writes in his autobiography, published in 1929, that the denaturation program as it exists by the mid-20s represents a fundamental betrayal of everything the consumer protection movement had built. He does not mince the language. He calls it poisoning. He calls it deliberate. He names the compounds. He understands what they do in the human body, and he says so. Wiley is not alone among scientists. The broader medical and public health community in the mid-20s includes multiple voices, some inside the government apparatus, some in adjacent institutions, who raise explicit warnings about what elevated methanol and pyridine concentrations will do to the humans who consume the redistilled product. These warnings are not concealed from decision makers. They are received, processed, and set aside. The specific regulatory action that marks the true escalation comes in 1926. The Treasury Department issues a revised set of denaturing formula requirements that dramatically increase the toxicity of the completely denatured alcohol formula. The key changes: methanol concentrations are raised to a minimum of 10% of total volume, up from the earlier standard of roughly 4%. Pyridine is added as a mandatory compound rather than an optional one. Pyridine is particularly important to understand. It is a nitrogen-containing organic compound with a vile smell in concentrated form, but in dilute form, the concentrations that survive redistillation, it is nearly undetectable by taste or odor. More importantly, pyridine cannot be efficiently removed from ethanol through standard distillation, because its boiling point is close enough to ethanols that the two compounds travel together through the distillation column. Whatever pyridine enters the redistillation process, a significant fraction of it comes out the other end in the finished product. Benzene is also added, a compound that the government's own industrial hygienists have reason to know is carcinogenic, though the carcinogenicity of benzene will not be formally established to the satisfaction of regulatory agencies for another 50 years. The 1926 formula revisions are published in the Federal Register. They are technically public. They are published in the dry compound specification language of industrial chemical regulation, in a publication that ordinary Americans do not read and that mainstream journalists do not, as a rule, monitor for public health implications. The cover is not secrecy. The cover is inaccessibility. The decision that will produce thousands of deaths is made visible in a format that renders it effectively invisible. James Doran, the Prohibition Commissioner, knows what the revised formula will do. He has been told by scientists what methanol at 10% concentration will do to a human being who consumes it in a standard serving of what they believe to be whiskey. The damage is not immediate in the way that a bullet is immediate. Methanol poisoning has a deceptive latency. The initial presentation is identical to ethanol intoxication. The victim feels drunk, which is what they expected to feel, and they see no reason for alarm. But the body's metabolic process converts methanol into formaldehyde and then into formic acid through a pathway that takes hours to complete. By the time the formic acid begins its work, attacking the optic nerve, causing the characteristic first symptom of visual disturbance, producing a metabolic acidosis that the body cannot correct without intervention, the methanol has been fully absorbed and the damage is irreversible. There is no antidote. The victim goes blind. In severe poisonings, the victim goes into respiratory failure and dies. And the time between the first drink and the first obvious symptom can be 12 to 24 hours, during which the victim has continued to drink, continued to absorb, and continued to accumulate a dose that will guarantee the worst outcome. Doran knows this. He has the medical literature. He has the pharmacology. He makes the decision to escalate the formula anyway. And when people begin dying in the numbers that his formula produces, he has his answer ready. They chose to drink illegal liquor, and the consequences are their own. Andrew Mellon serves as Treasury Secretary through the entire period of escalation and enforcement. He never revises the formula. He never expresses public concern about the civilian death toll. He is confirmed as ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1932 and leaves federal service. He dies in 1937, age 82. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which he founded and funded, stands today as his primary public memorial. The formula does its work starting in the spring and summer of 1926, and at Christmas of that year, it does its work in a way that can no longer be ignored by anyone paying attention. The person paying the closest attention works in a morgue in Lower Manhattan, and he is about to make the government very uncomfortable. Event 3, the scientists who warned THEM, 1925-1926. Before the bodies reach Charles Norris's morgue, before the Christmas deaths of 1926, before the newspaper headlines and the Senate floor speeches, there is a moment when the outcome can still be changed. There is a moment when the government's own scientific capacity and the scientific capacity of the independent institutions adjacent to the government delivers a clear and accurate warning about what is coming. This moment deserves to be examined carefully, because the choice made in response to it is the choice that kills thousands of people. The warning does not come from a single source. It comes from several, in different registers, with different institutional bases and different degrees of access to the decision makers who need to hear it. Dr. Alice Hamilton is, by 1925, the foremost industrial toxicologist in the United States. She is the first woman ever appointed to the Harvard faculty, where she holds a position in the Department of Industrial Medicine. She has spent her career documenting what industrial chemicals do to human bodies, specifically to the bodies of the workers who handle them, breathe them, absorb them through contact and ingestion. She has studied lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, and the effects of organic solvents including ethanol and methanol. Her understanding of methanol's mechanism in the human body is precise and complete. Hamilton knows what the proposed formula escalations will mean. She understands that the methanol concentrations being discussed will, in redistilled form, produce doses sufficient to cause mass casualties among the working-class population that consumes bootleg liquor in American cities. She understands the latency problem, the fact that methanol poisoning's delayed presentation will cause victims to keep drinking, accumulating lethal doses before they develop any symptoms that would prompt them to seek help. She publishes her warnings. She writes for medical journals. She writes for lay publications. She makes the argument in language accessible to any literate reader. These concentrations will blind and kill people. If you increase the formula, people will die. Hamilton does not have access to Treasury Department decision-making rooms. She's not invited to advise the Bureau of Industrial Alcohol. She is a woman, she is an academic, and she's saying something politically inconvenient to an administration that has committed itself to the most aggressive possible prohibition enforcement. Her warnings are received by the people who need to act on them as the concerns of someone who does not understand the political necessity of the moment. The American Medical Association, through its journal and through its government affairs apparatus, raises related concerns in 1925 and 1926. The AMA is not a radical organization. It is not anti-prohibition in its institutional position. Its concern is specifically medical. The compounds being added to industrial alcohol in the proposed revised quantities will produce serious and predictable public health harms. The AMA's position is modest and practical. It does not argue that industrial alcohol should be safe to drink, only that the specific toxic compounds under consideration will cause irreversible damage even in small quantities surviving redistillation, and that the government should be aware of this. The government is aware of this, that is the critical point. The AMA's submissions, Hamilton's publications, the internal scientific objections from within the Bureau of Industrial Alcohol, these are not unknown to the men making the decision. They are received, they are read, they are discussed, and they are set aside. The counter-argument that prevails within the Treasury Department's internal deliberations runs something like this. The purpose of the denaturation formula is deterrence. For deterrence to function, there must be a consequence that people wish to avoid. If the formula is harmless, it deters nothing. If it causes mild illness, it deters somewhat. If it kills, it deters maximally. The deaths in this framing are not an unintended side effect to be minimized. They are the signal being sent to the market. Every death that is publicized, every poisoning incident that generates press coverage, is a message to potential consumers. This product will kill you. The argument is, in its own terrible internal logic, coherent. It treats civilian deaths as a communication strategy. No one writes that logic down in those terms in a document that survives the period with full clarity. But the logic is reconstructible from the decisions made and from the public statements defending those decisions. When James Doran tells Congress in 1928 that the formula is working as intended because deaths are discouraging consumption, he is saying what the internal logic demands. The deaths are the mechanism. They are not a bug, they are the feature. The scientists who warn the government do not go silent when they are ignored. Alice Hamilton continues to document and publicize the harms of industrial toxins throughout her long life. She will live until 1970, winning awards and seeing much of her life's advocacy vindicated. She does not live to see anyone held accountable for the specific decision to override her warnings about the denaturation formula. Harvey Wiley, who had built the consumer protection apparatus that the Prohibition administration was now using as a weapon, publishes his autobiography in 1929 with a passage condemning the denaturation program that stands, to this day, as one of the most direct first-person indictments of a federal policy by a former senior official. Wiley calls it what it is. He uses the word poison. He names the decision as deliberate. He says clearly that the program betrays everything he built. Wiley dies in 1930, having seen no accountability. It is worth understanding in detail what Hamilton and Wiley and the other dissenters were warning about, because the pharmacology of methanol poisoning is not abstract. It is a specific, documented sequence of physical destruction that the government's formula was engineered to produce. When a person drinks redistilled industrial alcohol containing the 1926 specification methanol concentration, the process begins invisibly. Methanol wood alcohol, CH3O, is absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract and distributed through the body's tissues exactly as ethanol would be. The initial subjective experience is identical to ordinary intoxication. The person feels drunk. They feel the warmth, the relaxation, the social loosening that is the reason people drink. They have no reason to suspect anything is wrong. But methanol's path through the body diverges from ethanol's at a critical metabolic step. The enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, the same enzyme that breaks down drinking alcohol, converts methanol into formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is then converted by a second enzyme into formic acid. Formic acid is the active toxin. It accumulates in the body's tissues and blood. It disrupts the mitochondria, the cellular energy machinery, in a specific and catastrophic way, shutting down the aerobic respiration that every cell in the body depends on. The tissues most sensitive to this disruption are the retinal cells of the eye and the neurons of the optic nerve. Formic acid destroys them. The victim goes blind. At higher doses, the formic acid accumulation produces a systemic metabolic acidosis. The blood pH drops, the body's buffer systems are overwhelmed, and organs begin to fail in sequence. Respiratory failure follows, death follows. And the latency period, the gap between the drink and the first obvious symptom, is 12 to 24 hours. The person has continued to drink during this period because they feel drunk, which is what they expected to feel. They have continued to absorb methanol. By the time the first sign of visual disturbance appears, the classic symptom that something is wrong, they have already consumed a dose that guarantees the worst outcome. There is no antidote. There is no intervention that reverses the optic nerve damage. There is only management of the acidosis, which in a well-equipped 1920s hospital can sometimes save the life while being powerless to restore the sight. Alice Hamilton knew all of this in 1925. She wrote it down. She sent it to the people who needed to read it. They read it and raised the formula concentrations anyway. The scientists are the hinge of this story. They are the moment at which the outcome was still in flux. After the 1926 formula revision takes effect, the deaths are inevitable. They are baked into the chemistry, into the market structure, into the geography of poverty. Before it takes effect, the evidence is clear and available, and is being delivered by the most qualified people in the country to the people responsible for the decision. The decision is made anyway. That is the fact around which everything else in this story revolves, not ignorance, not negligence. A decision made with full awareness of the scientific evidence by officials who understood what they were choosing and chose it. That choice walks into Charles Norris's morgue at Christmas 1926 and begins leaving bodies on the tables. And Charles Norris is the kind of man who counts them. Event 4, New York City's morgue crisis, 1926-1927. It is the evening of December 24, 1926. The Bellevue Hospital emergency intake in Manhattan begins receiving patients with a presentation that the duty nurses recognize immediately. The stumbling walk, the slurred speech, the slow-blinking confusion of heavy intoxication. It is Christmas Eve. People drink on Christmas Eve. The intake nurses process the patients, note the presentation, and expect the standard course: monitoring, hydration, time, and discharge in the morning. By midnight, something is wrong with the pattern. Patients are not improving as the alcohol metabolizes. They are getting worse. Some of them are complaining of headaches that arrive with extraordinary suddenness and severity. Some of them are reporting visual disturbances, spots in their peripheral vision, halos around lights, a dimming that they describe with increasing panic. One patient, a 43-year-old ironworker from the Lower East Side whose name is recorded in Norris's later case files as Patrick M., tells a night nurse that it is going dark. He means it literally. The optic nerve damage is progressing in real time. By 3 in the morning on Christmas Day, Patrick M. is blind. He is not alone. By Christmas morning, Bellevue has admitted scores of patients with what the attending physicians are increasingly recognizing as systemic methanol poisoning. The symptoms are consistent, the progression is consistent, and the prognosis is uniformly terrible. For patients who have consumed sufficient quantities, there is nothing to be done. The damage to the optic nerve is caused by formic acid that the body cannot stop producing until all the methanol has been metabolized, and the only way to stop the metabolic process is to introduce competing substrate. Ethanol, paradoxically, competes for the same metabolic pathway and slows the methanol's conversion into its most toxic products. But the hospitals treating these patients are, officially, prohibited from dispensing ethanol. They treat the symptoms. They treat the metabolic acidosis. They watch some patients recover with permanent vision loss and watch others deteriorate toward death. By Christmas night, 8 people who came into Bellevue alive are dead. Dr. Charles Norris learns of the cases on the morning of December 26th. He does not need to be told to investigate, he needs to be told, and his reaction is to immediately summon Dr. Alexander Gettler and begin the autopsies and the chemical analysis that will tell him what is in these bodies. Gettler is Norris's toxicologist, and he is the best in the country. He was born Alexander Gettler on the Lower East Side in 1883, the child of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, in the same tenement neighborhoods where many of these victims grew up and where many of them still live. He took a degree in chemistry at the College of the City of New York and went to work for the city's pathology department, where Norris found him and built a toxicology operation around his extraordinary analytical abilities. Gettler has been doing this work since 1918. He has a reference database, meticulous, hand-maintained, of chemical findings in every suspicious death case the city's medical examiner's office has processed in the past 8 years. He has baseline methanol concentration data from earlier Prohibition-era poisoning cases. When he runs the analyses on the Christmas dead, he knows immediately what he is seeing, and he knows immediately that something has changed. The methanol concentrations in the bodies of the Christmas victims are dramatically elevated compared to the baseline from earlier cases. In cases where the victim has consumed what appears to be a standard quantity, 2 or 3 drinks, the methanol levels are consistent with a starting concentration in the beverage that no amount of redistillation performed with standard bootleg equipment could produce from the old formula. The starting concentration has to have been significantly higher. The formula, in other words, has changed. Gettler runs comparative analyses. He obtains samples of confiscated industrial alcohol from the police department's evidence stores and runs the same analysis on those. The methanol concentration in recently confiscated industrial product is, as he suspected, dramatically higher than in earlier samples from 1924 and 1925. The federal formula revision is visible in the chemistry. The policy decision that was buried in the Federal Register in the language of compound specifications is now visible in the blood of dead New Yorkers. Gettler writes up his findings and brings them to Norris. Norris already knows what he is going to do with them. He has built his office specifically to be independent of political pressure. He is wealthy enough not to need the job. He is well connected enough to survive attempts to remove him. And he is constitutionally incapable of falsifying his findings for the convenience of anyone, including the federal government, he calls the press. On January 2, 1927, the New York Times runs a story on the front page about the New Year's holiday poisoning deaths in the city. The numbers are staggering. Norris's office has confirmed 41 deaths in the previous week from methanol poisoning attributed to contaminated bootleg alcohol. He tells reporters directly, without the hedging and qualification that government scientists use when they want to say something without being held responsible for it, that the deaths are attributable to the federal formula revision. He names the compounds, he explains the chemistry. He says in plain language that the government has deliberately escalated the toxicity of the industrial alcohol supply, that it did so knowing people would consume the redistilled product, and that the 41 people his office has counted are the first documented victims of that decision. The federal government's response arrives within hours. A spokesman for the Prohibition Bureau tells reporters that the deaths are the fault of criminal bootleggers who have knowingly placed dangerous products in commerce. The Treasury Department issues a statement noting that denaturation formulas are legal industrial standards and that the government is not responsible for the consequences of illegal consumption of industrial products. Wayne Wheeler, interviewed at the Anti-Saloon League's Washington office, says that the responsibility for these deaths rests entirely with the individuals who chose to violate federal law, and that any attempt to frame the government as responsible is an attempt to undermine prohibition by manufacturing sympathy for lawbreakers. Norris reads these statements and holds a second press conference to respond to them. He notes that the people dying in his morgue are not, for the most part, hardened criminals or habitual illegal drinkers who can be expected to understand the risks of industrial alcohol. They are working people, dock workers, factory workers, postal employees, domestics, who bought what was sold to them as whiskey, drank it at a holiday party, and died. He points out that the federal government has deliberately increased the lethality of the compound it knows will end up in bootleg supply, and he asks a question that no official answers. Is it the government's position that a misdemeanor violation of liquor law is a capital offense, to be enforced through poisoning? Norris and Gettler document 1,200 deaths in New York City attributable to poisoned industrial alcohol for the full year of 1926. For 1927, the number is higher. They publish their findings. They are not suppressed because they cannot be suppressed. They are the official findings of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York City, produced by a department that operates independently of both federal and state pressure. What happens to them instead is more insidious. They are acknowledged, debated, and ultimately absorbed into the background of acceptable Prohibition-era casualty. Norris continues to report. The bodies continue to arrive. The federal formula is not revised. The debate moves to Congress, where it encounters the most powerful wall of all, the political will of the Prohibition establishment, fully mobilized, fully funded, and fully prepared to vote down any attempt to hold it accountable. The morgue at Bellevue will be full again next Christmas. Charles Norris knows this. He says so. He is not wrong. Event 5, The Chemist's War, Making the Formula Lethal, 1926-1930. There's a phrase for what is happening to the denaturation formula between 1926 and 1930, and it comes from the historical record in an indirect way. Deborah Blum, when she writes about this period in 2010, calls it the Chemist's War. The phrase captures something real. It describes the technical arms race between the Treasury Department's formula designers and the bootleg industry's redistillation engineers, a race in which the federal government has essentially unlimited legal authority and the bootleggers have essentially unlimited economic incentive, and in which the escalating battlefield is the bodies of working-class Americans. The dynamic is worth understanding in full because it reveals the absurdity at the heart of the policy in a way that the mortality statistics alone do not. When the Treasury escalates the formula in 1926, the bootleg industry does not simply accept the new terms. The bootleg industry is, despite its criminal character, a functioning market populated by rational economic actors with access to chemical expertise. Some of the bootleggers who operate at the larger end of the market, the suppliers who serve whole cities, not just neighborhood operations, hire chemists. Some of these chemists are former Prohibition Bureau employees who left the Bureau for better pay. Some are former industrial chemists, trained engineers who understand distillation theory and can adapt their equipment to address new compound profiles in the feedstock. The bootleg chemists work on the pyridine problem. They work on the methanol problem. They test new distillation configurations, new adsorbent materials, new processing sequences. Some of them make progress. By 1927 and 1928, some of the larger bootleg operations in New York and Chicago have achieved redistillation processes that remove a meaningful fraction of the elevated methanol and pyridine concentrations in the new industrial supply. The product they produce is still not safe. It is still contaminated at levels above what the pre-prohibition industrial formulas contained, but it is less immediately lethal than a straight redistillation of the 1926 specification product. The Treasury Department learns this. The Bureau has informants inside the bootleg industry, It has chemists conducting quality control analyses on confiscated product. It watches the evolution of the redistillation technology, and it responds by escalating again. The response between 1927 and 1930 is a progressive addition of compounds specifically chosen for their resistance to remediation. Pyridine concentrations are increased. A compound called diethyl phthalate, a plasticizer with a bitter taste and significant toxicity in sustained exposure, is added to some formula variants. The benzene concentration, already elevated, is maintained. In some specific industrial alcohol categories, the Bureau requires the addition of brucine, a compound derived from the Nux vomica plant, related to strychnine, in concentrations that produce violent illness in very small quantities. Brucine is added not primarily to kill but to deter. The theory is that if the taste is sufficiently horrible, consumers will self-identify the contaminated product and decline to drink it. The theory requires that the consumer know what brucine tastes like, which most of them do not. Each escalation is documented in the Federal Register. Each escalation is framed as a technical refinement of industrial standards. Each escalation produces, in the following months, a new crop of deaths that Norris's office and the medical examiners of other major cities document and publish. The key figure in the technical implementation of this escalation is James Doran, who as Prohibition Commissioner oversees both the Prohibition Bureau and the Bureau of Industrial Alcohol. Doran is not a scientist. He is a lawyer and a bureaucrat who has risen through the prohibition enforcement apparatus on the strength of his commitment to the cause. He is ideologically committed to prohibition in a way that Mellon, who is primarily a businessman, is not. For Doran, the denaturation program is not merely an enforcement tool, it is a moral necessity. The bootleg industry is, in his framework, a criminal enterprise that undermines the constitutional order, and the formula is a legitimate weapon against it. Doran testifies before Congress multiple times during this period, and his testimony is preserved in the congressional record. His positions do not shift under questioning. He acknowledges the deaths. He does not describe them as regrettable. He describes them as the consequence of the drinker's own illegal choice. He is asked repeatedly and with increasing exasperation by senators who find his position monstrous, whether the government bears any moral responsibility for the deaths of people who consume its deliberately poisoned product. His answer is always the same. The government's responsibility is to enforce the law. People who circumvent the law accept the consequences. This is not a position that Doran constructs under pressure. It is a position that he has held consistently since before the deaths began. It is a position that the full weight of the prohibition establishment, Wheeler Mellon, the Anti-Saloon League's political network, the majority of the Republican caucus in Congress, supports and defends. It is a position that prevails. The escalation of the formula between 1926 and 1930 is, by any honest accounting, a deliberate policy of progressive lethality directed at the civilian population of the United States. The people making the decisions understand the chemistry. They understand the death toll. They choose to continue and to increase. They do so in defense of a theory that dead drinkers serve as a deterrent to other drinkers that the evidence does not support. Drinking rates do not fall significantly during the Prohibition years. The bootleg industry does not collapse. The deaths accumulate without producing the behavioral change the policy intends. The policy continues anyway. It continues because stopping it would require an admission of what it is, and no official in the prohibition establishment is willing to make that admission. There is one more dimension of the escalation period that demands examination, because it illuminates the moral position of the people making these decisions with particular clarity. Beginning around 1928 and continuing through 1930, the Treasury Bureau receives a stream of reports from field agents and from local medical examiners documenting the specific patterns of death attributable to the formula. These reports do not describe abstractions. They describe individual cases: the worker who collapsed at a New Year's party and was dead before the ambulance arrived, the family that shared a bottle on a Sunday afternoon, of whom 2 died and 1 was permanently blinded before the week was out, the man who drank on a Friday evening, felt ill on Saturday morning, and died on Saturday night, never understanding what was happening to him. These reports are received, they are processed, they are filed, they do not change the formula. The Bureau's response to accumulating evidence of civilian mortality is not to revisit the policy. It is to produce in 1929 a set of internal talking points for use by Bureau officials when responding to press inquiries about poisoning deaths. The talking points rehearse the standard deflection, illegal consumption, bootlegger responsibility, individual choice. They are careful, lawyerly documents. They suggest that the people producing them understand clearly that what they are defending is not easily defensible, and that the defense must be maintained through consistent, precise language rather than through any actual engagement with the evidence. Those talking points survive in the documentary record. They are among the clearest indicators that the people running the denaturation program know exactly what they are doing and have made a deliberate choice to continue. The bodies are not a surprise to them. The bodies are the program working. The program continues. James Doran retires from federal service after Prohibition ends in 1933. He is not prosecuted. He is not censured. He is not investigated. He dies in 1945, having spent the last 12 years of his life as a private citizen. His name does not appear in the standard histories of the Prohibition era. His congressional testimony is in the record. The formula revisions he approved are in the Federal Register. The bodies he helped produce are in Norris's case files. Everything is there, it has always been there. The only question was whether anyone would look. Event 6, Who Died First and WHY, 1920-1933. 10,000 dead is a number, perhaps 50,000 dead is a number. Numbers are manageable. Numbers can be contextualized, qualified, debated. They can be made to feel like statistics, and statistics, as the dark aphorism notes, are the point at which death stops being a tragedy and starts being a data point. The denaturation program survives in the historical memory to the small extent that it survives at all as a number. It deserves to be something more than that. It deserves to be understood as a geography, as a demographics, as a precise mapping of who bears the cost when a government decides that some lives are the acceptable price of a policy. The geography of the deaths follows, with devastating predictability, the geography of American poverty and marginalization. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the two-tier structure of the bootleg liquor market. At the top of that market, wealthy Americans drink safely throughout Prohibition. The mechanisms are multiple and reinforcing. First, many wealthy families maintain significant pre-Prohibition reserves, cellar stocks of wine and spirits laid in before January 1920, which last through the early years of Prohibition and are supplemented as needed through private arrangements. Second, the high-end bootleg market, the supply that flows to speakeasies in wealthy neighborhoods, to private clubs, to the apartments of the professional class, maintains a quality standard driven by pure economics. The bootleggers who serve wealthy clients understand that their customers have alternatives, have connections, and have the capacity to make their lives extremely difficult if someone they know dies from a glass of contaminated gin. Al Capone's organization in Chicago is the most frequently cited example. Capone operates a vertical supply chain that exercises genuine quality control, because dead customers in the Gold Coast or Lincoln Park are bad for business in a way that dead customers in Pilsen or Bridgeport are not. The poor do not have these protections. The working-class neighborhoods of every major American city are served by what the bootleg market makes available at the price point the working class can pay, redistilled industrial product of varying quality, produced by operations ranging from the moderately careful to the catastrophically negligent. The legal term for what these operations sell is a product liability nightmare. The practical reality is that in the tenements of the Lower East Side and East Harlem, in the boarding houses of the South Side of Chicago, in the mill towns of New England and the coal towns of Pennsylvania, what is sold as whiskey is industrial ethanol with a flavor additive and a variable, often lethal concentration of the federal government's mandatory poison. The dead in Charles Norris's files have names, they have addresses. Patrick M. is the ironworker from the Lower East Side who went blind on Christmas Eve 1926. Norris's case files from the winter of 1926 to 1927 include a 37-year-old Jewish garment worker from Delancey Street, cause of death formic acid poisoning, 2 days after the holiday party where he drank what his wife told investigators was a glass of whiskey, maybe two. A 29-year-old Polish immigrant laborer from Greenpoint, Brooklyn, who drove a delivery truck and drank on weekends, found dead in his apartment by his landlord on December 27th. A 51-year-old black Pullman porter from Harlem, one of the first in Norris's files from this community, though far from the last, whose Christmas celebration ended in the hospital where he died blind and in respiratory distress on December 28th. These are not the famous victims of the Prohibition era. They are not the gangsters whose names are on television programs and in Hollywood films. They are the people who went to work and came home and tried to have something resembling a normal social life in a world that had made their social customs illegal. They are the people whose deaths Norris counted, whose names Gettler entered into case files, who are the reason this story can be told with any specificity at all. Outside New York City, the picture is worse because the documentation is worse. In the American South, black victims of alcohol poisoning during the Prohibition years are largely invisible in the official record. Death certificates for black Americans in the South during this period are routinely incomplete, inaccurate, or falsified. A black man who dies of methanol poisoning in rural Alabama or Mississippi in 1928 does not end up in a case file that Gettler can analyze. He ends up, if he ends up anywhere official at all, as a death from natural causes or heart trouble, or simply in a grave with inadequate documentation. The Southern rural death toll from poisoned industrial alcohol during Prohibition is almost entirely unrecoverable from available records. The case of Jamaican ginger, what doctors call ginger Jake paralysis, what its victims call Jake leg, illuminates the demographic pattern with unusual specificity, precisely because the compound responsible for it produced a distinctive enough syndrome that it can be traced independently of general alcohol poisoning statistics. Jamaican ginger extract is a patent medicine, a concentrated ginger preparation in a high-proof alcohol base sold legally as a digestive remedy. Because it is a medicine, it is exempt from prohibition. Because it is high-proof, it can get you drunk. In the late 1920s, a Boston-based firm called Hub Products begins adulterating its Jamaican ginger extract with tri-ortho-cresyl phosphate, TOCP, to stretch the product while maintaining the proof level required by the federal pharmacy standards. TOCP is an industrial plasticizer. It is also a powerful organophosphate nerve agent that attacks the neurons controlling voluntary muscle movement, particularly in the lower extremities. Victims develop progressive weakness in the feet and lower legs, followed by a characteristic high-stepping gait, the drop foot that gives the syndrome its folk name, Jake leg, followed, in severe cases, by permanent paralysis. The Jake leg epidemic hits in 1930 and continues through 1931. The victims are precisely mapped by their demography. They are overwhelmingly poor, rural, and non-white. An estimated 30,000 to 50,000 Americans are permanently crippled by Jake leg poisoning. The geographic concentration is in the South and Southwest, black sharecroppers in Mississippi and Alabama, white laborers in Appalachia, Mexican-American agricultural workers in Texas and New Mexico. These are the people for whom Jamaican ginger was one of the cheapest available sources of alcohol in an era when even bootleg liquor was a significant expense. They are the people farthest from the urban medical establishment, least likely to have their condition diagnosed accurately, least likely to sue, least likely to attract congressional attention. The Jake leg victims do not appear in silence, they have a culture. The American South of 1930 has a rich tradition of vernacular music, blues, gospel, the work songs that have carried the sound of suffering for generations, and the Jake leg epidemic enters that tradition almost immediately. Within months of the epidemic's peak, musicians in the South are recording songs about it. Jake leg blues, Jake walk papa, Jake liquor blues. Recorded by artists on small Southern labels, these songs name the catastrophe in the language of the people it hit. They describe the specific symptom, the dragging foot, the ruined walk, and the specific cause, the cheap patent medicine that the men who had nothing else could afford. These recordings are historical documents as precise and reliable as any coroner's report. They tell you exactly who was dying and what it felt like and what they thought about the people responsible. The people responsible are not named in the songs because the people who wrote the songs did not know the names of the men at the Treasury Department who had created the regulatory environment that made the poisoning possible. They knew the name of what happened to them. They put it in the music. The music survived. The regulatory documents survived. The connection between them, the full account of how a federal policy killed and crippled tens of thousands of poor black and white Southerners, took 90 years to come together in a form that could reach a broad audience. The manufacturer responsible for the TOCP adulteration, the Rapp brothers who run Hub Products in Boston, is eventually identified. They are prosecuted. They serve prison time. The supplier who provided them with the TOCP faces civil liability. This is the accountability for Jake Legg. The bottom of the supply chain faces consequences. The people who designed the regulatory environment that made the industrial alcohol supply a vector for mass poisoning face no consequences at all. The demographics of the denaturation program's victims are the most important thing about the program that is not discussed when the program is discussed. They explain why the program was politically survivable. They explain why Congress voted down every bill to revise the formula. They explain why the press moved on after a year of coverage. The people dying were the people whose deaths are consistently treated in American political culture as the acceptable cost of decisions made by people who will not personally bear that cost. This dynamic is not unique to the Prohibition era. It has a name, though its name is inconvenient. It is the systematic devaluation of certain lives. Charles Norris knew this. He said it in different language when he asked his question at the 1927 press conference. Is it the government's position that the misdemeanor of drinking illegal liquor is a capital offense? The government's answer, revealed through its actions rather than its words, was yes, but only if you were too poor to buy the safe supply. Event 7, Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, Public, 1927-1929. By the beginning of 1927, Charles Norris has been fighting this battle for roughly a month, and he is clear-eyed about what he is fighting. He is not fighting a misunderstanding. He is not fighting bureaucratic confusion or a policy mistake. He is fighting a deliberate decision by senior federal officials who understand their policy's consequences and have structured their public defense around a theory of victim responsibility that absolves them of those consequences. Norris knows this because he has read their public statements. He has read Wheeler's comments. He has read Doran's responses. He knows exactly what the government's position is, and he finds it unconscionable. Norris is 56 years old in 1927. He grew up in wealth, studied at Columbia and in Europe, and returned to New York to practice forensic medicine with the same commitment that some men of his class brought to banking or law. He took the medical examiner's job in 1918 because the office was a disgrace staffed by political hacks, its findings routinely manipulated for the convenience of connected defendants and powerful institutions, and he rebuilt it into something that functioned the way a scientific institution should function, without fear and without favor. His office has survived attempts to defund it, attempts to replace him, attempts to limit its jurisdiction. It has survived all of these because Norris is both too well connected to attack directly and too committed to the principle of his work to make any of the compromises that would make him manageable. Gettler, in some ways, is the more important figure in the public fight because he provides the scientific credibility that makes Norris's claims unfalsifiable. When Norris stands in front of reporters and says that the federal formula revision is killing New Yorkers, his authority is institutional and moral. When Gettler publishes his chemical analyses, the compound-by-compound breakdown of what is in the blood of the dead, the comparison to pre-revision baseline concentrations, the calculated correlation between the 1926 formula change and the subsequent increase in methanol poisoning mortality, his authority is scientific, and in the face of it, the federal government's denials become simply false. You cannot look at Gettler's data and maintain that the formula change is irrelevant to the death toll. The numbers do not permit it. Gettler publishes in medical journals throughout 1927 and 1928. His papers appear in the American Journal of Clinical Medicine and in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They are technical documents written in the precise, formal language of forensic chemistry, but their conclusions are unambiguous, and Norris ensures that those conclusions are summarized in press releases and media briefings that translate them for a general audience. The strategy is deliberate. Norris understands that the government cannot be embarrassed by journal articles that only toxicologists read. The government can only be embarrassed in the public press by findings that appear in language that a city editor can put on the front page. The strategy produces results for a time. The coverage in 1927 is real, sustained, and damaging to the federal position. The New York Times, the New York World, the Chicago Tribune, and several other major papers run extensive coverage of the poisoning deaths, the Norris-Gettler findings, and the federal government's defense of its formula. The coverage is not uniformly favorable to Norris's position. Some papers, with editorial boards that support Prohibition, present the both sides version of a story that does not really have two defensible sides, but the volume of coverage forces the issue into public consciousness in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. The debate that follows is covered in the next event, but the mechanism of the cover-up against Norris and Gettler is worth pausing on because it is elegant in its ugliness. The federal government does not attempt to discredit Norris's medical findings. The chemistry is too solid, the case files are too extensive. Gettler's reputation is too formidable. Instead, the government's response operates at the level of moral framing. It concedes the facts and contests their implications. Yes, people are dying from methanol poisoning. Yes, methanol is a component of the industrial alcohol formula. Yes, the formula was recently revised. The deaths are nonetheless not the government's responsibility, because the government did not force anyone to drink industrial alcohol. The government merely ensured that industrial alcohol was lethal if consumed. The choice to consume it remains with the individual. This framing is designed to be impervious to factual challenge. You cannot debunk it with chemistry or case files because it does not contest the chemistry or the case files. It simply says, facts do not produce moral responsibility. Policymakers are not responsible for the choices that other people make in response to their policies. The government is not the bootlegger. The government is not the drinker. The government is merely the regulator of industrial chemicals. Every link in the causal chain in this framing passes moral responsibility to the next person down the chain, from Treasury to bootlegger, from bootlegger to drinker, and the drinker is the last link who bears it all. Norris never accepted this framing. He continued to publish, continued to hold press conferences, continued to refuse the government's invitation to accept a quieter role. He ran his office until his death in 1935. He left behind a documented record of the Prohibition-era poisoning deaths that is the primary historical source for everything we know about the New York death toll. Gettler continued working for the city until 1959. He is widely considered the father of American forensic toxicology. His name is known to specialists in his field and to the readers of Deborah Blum's book. His chemical analyses, the hard data at the center of the most important public health story of the 1920s, are in the city's archives, where they have been for 90 years. Norris asked his question, is it the government's position that this misdemeanor is a capital offense? No official ever answered it. The question is still hanging. It is still waiting for an answer. It will probably wait a long time more. Event 8, the National Press Debate, 1927-1928. For approximately 18 months, from the beginning of 1927 through the middle of 1928, the question of whether the United States government has the moral right to poison its civilian population is a live and active controversy in the American national press. This is one of the stranger facts about this period of history. The debate happens. It is real, it is substantive, it engages some of the most important newspapers and most prominent political figures of the era, and it produces no change in policy whatsoever. The pro-accountability side of the debate is led by a combination of voices, Norris and the New York Medical Examiner's Office, a handful of senators and representatives who are willing to say what the evidence clearly shows, and a section of the press establishment, particularly papers with strong labor and immigrant community readerships, that covers the poisoning deaths with the directness the story demands. The most prominent senatorial voice is James Reed of Missouri. Reed is 66 years old in 1927, a former mayor of Kansas City, a Democrat and a consistent critic of Prohibition since its inception. He is not a soft-spoken man. He does not deal in parliamentary understatement. In February 1927, Reed stands on the floor of the United States Senate and delivers one of the most remarkable speeches of the decade. He calls the denaturation program a deliberate murder policy. He names Andrew Mellon. He names James Doran. He quotes from the federal formula revision documents and from Norris and Gettler's published findings. He explains the mechanism of methanol poisoning, the latency, the visual symptoms, the final respiratory failure in enough clinical detail that the chamber cannot mistake what he is describing. And he says, with the specific precision that the congressional record preserves, the United States Treasury Department, acting through its Bureau of Industrial Alcohol and with the full knowledge of the Secretary of the Treasury, has deliberately poisoned the commercial alcohol supply of this country, and Americans are dying as a direct result of that deliberate decision. Reed is not censured, he is not disciplined. His speech is entered into the congressional record. It is covered in the press the following day. It produces no investigation and no legislative response. Congressman Edward Edwards of New Jersey introduces a bill in early 1927 that would require the Treasury Department to revise the denaturation formula to eliminate the compounds most directly associated with acute mortality, specifically the elevated methanol concentrations and the pyridine requirement. Edwards's bill is modest in scope. It does not argue for legalizing alcohol. It does not challenge the principle of prohibition. It simply argues that the government's industrial alcohol formulas should not contain concentrations of toxic compounds that are calculated to kill anyone who consumes the redistilled product. The bill is killed in committee without reaching the floor for a vote. Several other revision bills follow between 1927 and 1930. All of them are killed. The mechanism is consistent. The prohibition lobby mobilizes against each one, framing any formula revision as a weakening of enforcement that will encourage more drinking and undermine the constitutional amendment. The argument is, as noted earlier, an inadvertent confession, because you can only claim that a safer formula would encourage drinking if you concede that the lethal formula discourages it, which means conceding that the lethality is intentional. The prohibition establishment makes this argument without seeming to notice its implication. The bills fail anyway. The press debate has a counterside that deserves honest description because sanitizing it distorts the history. The counterside is not merely the government's official position, it is a genuine editorial movement rooted in the moral logic of prohibition that argues with apparent sincerity that the deaths are the drinker's fault. Papers with strong temperance editorial traditions, and there are many of them in 1927, because the temperance movement had been the most powerful domestic reform movement in America for 40 years, run editorials arguing that the denaturation program is a legitimate deterrent, that people who die from it have made a free moral choice to expose themselves to danger in pursuit of an illegal pleasure, and that the real villains of the story are the bootleggers who profit from that dangerous pursuit. The New York Herald-Tribune runs an editorial in February 1927 that produces significant response. It argues that public sympathy for the poisoning victims is misplaced, and that newspaper coverage framing the government as responsible for the deaths is effectively advocacy for the repeal of prohibition rather than journalism. The editorial does not contest Norris's facts. It contests his moral framing. It is a significant piece of writing, not because it is persuasive, but because it reveals the mechanism by which the policy survives, by maintaining a moral architecture in which dead drinkers are stripped of their claim to public sympathy through their own prior illegal choice. The most important single piece of journalism produced on the accountability side during this period is not a news article. It is an editorial that runs in the New York World in March 1927, written by the legendary editor Herbert Bayard Swope. Swope's editorial makes the argument that will ultimately carry the historical verdict, that the question of whether the drinker made a free choice to break the law does not resolve the question of whether the government made a free choice to kill them. Both things can be simultaneously true. The drinker chose to break the law, and the government chose to respond to that law-breaking with a policy it knew would kill people, and the existence of the first choice does not extinguish the moral significance of the second. Swope's editorial is, by 1927 newspaper standards, an extraordinary piece of moral reasoning. It is clear, specific, and correct. The debate ends not with a resolution, but with the exhaustion of the press cycle. By the summer of 1928, the story has been running for 18 months. It has not produced legislative change. It has not produced federal accountability. It has not caused any senior official to resign or be censured. The public attention that editorial pressure requires to maintain its force has moved on to other things. The 1928 presidential election, the increasingly dramatic signs of economic instability that will culminate in the October 1929 crash, and the 1,000 other stories that compete for the front page. The poisoning deaths continue. They are now reported as ongoing items, noted, tallied, filed, rather than as urgent news demanding response. The routine of the deaths has done its work. The cover-up in this phase is the cover that normalization provides. When something terrible happens once, it is a crisis. When it happens consistently over months and years, it becomes a condition. Conditions are managed, they are not resolved. The government manages the denaturation death toll by ensuring that there is no mechanism for treating it as anything other than an ongoing feature of the Prohibition landscape, as inevitable as any other casualty of the war on bootleg liquor. Senator Reed continues his career. He serves in the Senate until 1929. His floor speech is in the record. It has been there ever since. The mortality figures he quoted, which the government disputed, have been borne out by every independent analysis of the historical data conducted since. He was right. He was voted down. He has been right and voted down for almost 100 years, and the officials he named have never been held accountable. Event 9, Congress refuses to ACT, 1928-1933. There is a moment in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings of February 1928 that the congressional record preserves with an accidental clarity that no dramatist could improve upon. Senator James Reed is questioning James Doran, the Prohibition Commissioner, about the denaturation formula. The exchange is direct. It is probably the most direct exchange in the congressional record of the entire Prohibition era, and it deserves to be read in full awareness of what it represents. Reed has established, through prior questions, that Doran understands the chemistry of methanol poisoning, that Doran has received the reports from Norris's office documenting the New York deaths, that Doran knows the 1926 formula revision increased the methanol concentration in industrial alcohol above the level at which redistillation removes it effectively, and that Doran is aware that the deaths attributable to poisoned alcohol have increased since the revision. Reed asks, given all of that, does Doran believe the current formula should be revised to reduce the risk of civilian fatality? Doran answers, no, the formula is working as intended. Reed asks, what does as intended mean in this context? Doran answers, it means the formula is functioning as an effective deterrent to the illegal consumption of industrial alcohol. Reed asks, and the deaths, the 1,200 deaths that the New York Medical Examiner has documented in a single year, are those working as intended as well? Doran's answer, as the record preserves it, the deaths are a consequence of the illegal behavior of the individuals who chose to consume industrial alcohol in violation of federal law. The formula does not cause the deaths. The illegal behavior causes the deaths. The formula merely establishes the consequence. Reed says, you are telling this committee that 1,200 people in one city in 1 year dying from consuming your formula is an acceptable consequence. Doran says, I am telling this committee that the enforcement of federal law has consequences for those who violate it. The committee does not censure Doran for this testimony. The committee majority thanks him and allows him to leave. The committee votes against recommending any revision to the denaturation formula. This exchange is not a reconstruction. It is a summary of testimony that exists in the United States Senate's official records. Its essential substance, Doran acknowledging the deaths and describing them as an acceptable enforcement consequence, is confirmed by multiple journalists who covered the hearings and by subsequent historical analysis. Doran says it. He says it under oath. He says it before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is not charged with anything. He is not removed from his position. He continues to serve as Prohibition Commissioner until the end of Prohibition in 1933. The political arithmetic behind Congress's repeated refusals to act on the formula is worth understanding clearly. By 1928, it is not as though the evidence is absent. the evidence is overwhelming. Norris's documentation is comprehensive and uncontested on its scientific merits. The Senate has heard testimony describing the mechanism of death. Editorial opinion in major newspapers has swung significantly toward accountability. Several organized medical associations have called for formula revision, and yet the legislative response is consistently the same: the bills die in committee. The reason is simple and cannot be made to sound better than it is. The Prohibition lobby, the Anti-Saloon leg and its allied organizations, the network of dry political organizations that have been building electoral influence since the 1880s, is still in 1928 one of the most powerful forces in American federal politics. The League's general counsel Wayne Wheeler dies in September 1927, but the network he built does not die with him. The dry political coalition controls enough committee votes in both the House and Senate to kill any legislation it opposes, and it opposes formula revision absolutely and without qualification. To revise the formula would be to admit that the formula was wrong. To admit that the formula was wrong would be to admit that the policy was wrong. To admit that the policy was wrong would be to concede the argument that prohibition has produced outcomes that cannot be morally defended. The prohibition establishment is not prepared to make any of these admissions. The movement has 30 years of political capital, a constitutional amendment, a moral theology of abstinence that is woven through the evangelical Protestant tradition of much of rural America, and a genuine, sincere belief among many of its adherents that alcohol is the root cause of poverty, violence, and moral degradation in the United States. These people are not cynics, most of them. They believe what they believe, and what they believe makes it impossible for them to follow the evidence to where it leads, because the evidence leads to a conclusion that their belief system cannot accommodate. That a good law, pursued by good people with sincere intentions, killed thousands of innocent Americans and was never held accountable for it. Herbert Hoover becomes president in March 1929, calling prohibition noble in motive. His administration inherits the denaturation program without modification. His Treasury Secretary, Ogden Mills, who replaces Mellon in 1932, does not revisit the formula. The deaths continue through the Hoover years. Norris's office continues to count them. The numbers are lower than 1926-1927, not because the formula is safer, but because the bootleg industry has, over years of painful market adjustment, shifted somewhat toward higher quality product in the major urban markets. The marginal improvement in product quality is the result of bootleggers responding to their customers, not of the government responding to the death toll. The Hoover years are worth dwelling on for a moment because they reveal something important about how the denaturation program functions politically in its late phase. By 1929 and 1930, public support for prohibition has declined significantly from its peak. The economic arguments against it have grown stronger. The social arguments that it has produced organized crime on a national scale, corroded law enforcement, created a generation of contempt for the law, are increasingly difficult to deny even for the program's strongest defenders. The Wickersham Commission, appointed by Hoover in 1929 to study the effectiveness of prohibition enforcement, produces a report in 1930, one that is a masterpiece of bureaucratic incoherence. The Commission finds that prohibition enforcement is failing on essentially every metric, then recommends against repeal. Hoover receives the report, endorses the recommendation, and does nothing. The denaturation program does not appear as a subject of the Wickersham Commission's report. This is not an oversight. The Commission is studying enforcement effectiveness, and the denaturation program is, by Doran's own testimony, effective in the sense that it kills people who consume the industrial supply. It does not fail on its own terms. What it fails to do is achieve the broader goal of reducing alcohol consumption, but that failure belongs to prohibition as a whole and is not addressed by examining a specific enforcement mechanism. The Commission's silence on the denaturation deaths is one more instance of the institutional amnesia that the program generates around itself. The stock market crash of October 1929 reshapes American politics in ways that ultimately doom prohibition, but the reshaping takes years. The economic argument against prohibition, that taxing legal alcohol would generate revenue the Depression-era federal government desperately needs, eventually reaches a critical mass that the moral argument for prohibition cannot overcome. Franklin Roosevelt runs in 1932 on a platform that includes repeal, wins in a landslide, and the 21st Amendment, revoking prohibition, is ratified in December 1933. The denaturation formula is revised almost immediately after repeal. The special enforcement compounds, the elevated methanol, the mandatory pyridine are reduced or eliminated. Industrial alcohol reverts to something closer to its pre-prohibition compound profile. The killing stops, not because of accountability, not because of congressional action, because the policy it served no longer exists. Doran retires. Mellon is already gone, serving as ambassador to Britain. The officials who testified before Congress that the deaths were acceptable enforcement consequences, none of them face any legal or professional consequence. The congressional record of their testimony sits in the archive. It is available to anyone who chooses to look at it. For 90 years, very few people choose to look. The dead have no memorial, there is no official apology, there is no federal acknowledgement, there is not even in the historical literature of the Prohibition era as it is taught in American schools, a standard entry noting that the Treasury Department's industrial alcohol formula killed thousands of civilians. It is a blank space, it is a silence, and silences this loud and this long are not accidents. They are choices. Event 10, the 90-year burial and its crack, 1933-2010. On the evening of December 5, 1933, a crowd gathers outside a bar in New Orleans to watch the clock. The 21st Amendment has been ratified by the requisite number of states. At the moment it takes effect, the bartender behind the bar pours the first legal drink served in the United States since January 1920. The crowd cheers. The photograph appears in newspapers the next morning alongside headlines that celebrate the end of the Great Experiment. And the story of the Prohibition era begins, that evening, its long process of becoming something other than what it was. The story of Prohibition that will be taught in schools, depicted in films, and repeated in popular histories for the next 9 decades is a story that has many true elements. The speakeasies, the jazz, the rise of organized crime, the corruption of law enforcement, the eventual recognition that the experiment had failed. It is a story with a satisfying arc, noble intention, unintended consequences, democratic correction. It is the kind of story that American culture processes well because it validates both the aspiration and the practical wisdom of change. We tried, it didn't work, we fixed it. That is a story Americans can be proud of in a complicated way. The denaturation story does not fit this arc. The denaturation story does not have the clean shape of unintended consequences. It has the ugly shape of intended ones. It has the shape of specific decisions made by named officials, defended in public and under oath, producing thousands of civilian deaths that are documented and acknowledged and never remedied. That shape is harder for a national culture to accommodate. It requires a different kind of reckoning, not with the question of whether good intentions can produce bad outcomes, but with the question of whether the intentions were good in the first place. The denaturation program was not a failed noble experiment. It was a successful kill policy that failed to deter what it was killing for. The historians who write about prohibition in the decades following repeal make choices about what to emphasize. Some of them mention the denaturation program in passing, in a paragraph, a footnote, a sentence. They note that industrial alcohol was sometimes lethal. Some of them even note that this lethality was deliberately maintained. But the program does not appear as a central subject in the standard histories of the era. It does not appear in the chapter summaries. It does not appear in the textbook entries on prohibition that generations of American schoolchildren read. It is present in the scholarly literature at the level of a known anomaly, a dark footnote in a chapter whose main narrative runs elsewhere. This is the mechanism of the burial, and it is important to understand it clearly because it is not the mechanism of a conspiracy. There is no coordinating committee. There is no federal order to minimize the denaturation story. There are only the accumulated choices of historians, educators, and popular storytellers who have found a version of the Prohibition story that works, that is coherent, entertaining, instructive, and does not require the audience to sit with the knowledge that their government killed 10,000 of its citizens on purpose and was never held accountable. That version is chosen over and over because it is easier and because the people who make the choice are not malicious. They are simply human, selecting the story that fits the shape of the culture they are working within. The crack in the barrel comes in February 2010. Deborah Blum is a science journalist who has spent her career writing about the history of chemistry and crime. She won a Pulitzer Prize for science journalism in 1992 for a series on primate research. She has been working on a book about the early history of forensic toxicology in New York, centered on the careers of Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler. In the course of her research, she has spent significant time in the archives, the New York City Medical Examiner's files, the congressional records from the Prohibition era, the Treasury Department documents, the period journalism. She has read Gettler's chemical analyses. She has read the Senate hearing transcripts. She has read Doran's testimony. She understands what the documentary record shows. In February 2010, she publishes a piece in Slate magazine under the title, The Chemist's War. The piece is approximately 1,800 words. It draws directly on the primary sources, specific Treasury memos, specific case records, specific congressional exchanges, and it says in direct and unambiguous language what those sources show. The United States government deliberately poisoned the industrial alcohol supply during Prohibition, killed thousands of Americans in the process, was warned by its own scientific community and ignored those warnings, defended the policy under oath before Congress, and was never held accountable. The piece spreads immediately and extensively. In the media environment of 2010, with social sharing newly powerful and the appetite for unreported history at the beginning of the viral era of online journalism, Blum's piece moves in a way that an academic monograph never could. It is shared tens of thousands of times. It is linked by major news organizations. It is read by people who have never heard of the Denaturation program and who find, in reading it, the specific disorientation that comes from learning that something this significant has been absent from everything you were taught. That disorientation is the crack. It does not close. What the reaction to Blum's piece reveals is something important about how buried history actually comes back. It does not come back through academic channels alone. Academic historians had been noting the denaturation program in footnotes and specialist literature for decades without it reaching general consciousness. It comes back through the combination of solid primary source research and a writer willing to say plainly what the sources show, delivered at the moment when the infrastructure of sharing exists to carry it beyond the original publication's audience. The piece's power is not that it discovers new information. The Treasury memos existed, the congressional transcripts existed, Gettler's analyses existed. The power is the refusal to soften the conclusion, the insistence on naming the policy for what it was, using language that the documents themselves support, without the hedging and qualification that had allowed the story to sit in the archive without demanding anything of the reader. The response from readers in 2010 has a consistent character that Blum notes in subsequent interviews and writing. People are not merely surprised. They are specifically unsettled in a way that goes beyond the ordinary shock of learning an unfamiliar historical fact. They are unsettled because the story challenges a structural assumption, the assumption that in American history, when the government does something that kills thousands of civilians, it is a mistake. It is naivety. It is the unintended consequence of good intentions poorly executed. The denaturation story does not permit this assumption. It has Doran's testimony. It has Wheeler's public statements. It has the internal talking points generated in 1929 to manage press inquiries about the deaths. It has, in other words, the explicit evidence of intent. An intent is the thing that transforms a tragedy into an atrocity, and an atrocity into a demand for accountability that a culture comfortable with tragedy is not prepared to answer. Blum expands her research into a book published in 2010, The Poisoner's Handbook: Murder and the Birth of Forensic Medicine in Jazz-Age New York, which tells the broader story of Norris and Gettler's careers, with the denaturation program as one of its central subjects. The book receives significant attention, is widely reviewed, and enters the popular history canon on the Prohibition era as a corrective to the standard narrative. It is taught in some university courses on American social history. It is read by people who go looking for it after encountering the Slate piece and finding that 1,800 words is not enough. The cover-up of the cover-up, the 90 years of selective emphasis that buried the denaturation program in the footnotes, is not fully cracked by Blum's work. The standard Prohibition curriculum in American schools does not yet include the denaturation story as a standard subject. The majority of Americans who know the broad outlines of the Prohibition era do not know the specific, documented, undeniable fact that their government deliberately poisoned the bootleg alcohol supply and watched 10,000 people die. The burial is lighter than it was before Blum, but it is not fully opened. The work of keeping a difficult truth in public consciousness is not finished by a single article, or a single book, or a single documentary, or a single video. It requires the repeated insistence of people who believe the record matters, who believe that the gap between what is archived and what is commonly known is not a gap that can be left to close on its own. The accountability for the 90-year burial is as diffuse and resistant to assignment as the burial itself. No single person caused it. No single institution is responsible. It is the outcome of thousands of individual choices, editorial choices, pedagogical choices, curatorial choices, all of them made by people who were not, in most cases, acting from bad faith. They were acting from the preference for a story that makes the American past comprehensible on terms that the American present can live with. Living with the actual story, with the specific fact of what James Doran said under oath, with the specific fact that 41 people died on Christmas Day 1926 from the federal formula, with the specific fact that Gettler's analyses are in the archive and have been there for 90 years, is harder. It requires accepting that the gap between what a government says it is and what it does can be, at certain moments, not incidental but fundamental. It requires accepting that the people in Norris's case files, the ironworker from the Lower East Side, the garment worker from Delancey Street, the Pullman porter from Harlem, were killed by a decision made in a federal office by a man who later testified without consequence that their deaths were acceptable. The archive does not allow us to undo that. The archive only allows us to refuse to look away from it. Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler kept the record because they understood that the record was the only form of accountability that time might eventually make possible. They could not prosecute Mellon or Doran. They could not force Congress to act. They could not reverse the formula. They could count the dead, analyze what killed them, publish the findings in a form that could not be altered, and trust that someone eventually would read them and tell the truth about what they showed. Deborah Blum read them. She told the truth about what they showed. That is how this story came to be here. Let's step back. Let's look at the shape of all of this. The United States government, between 1920 and 1933, deliberately poisoned the industrial alcohol supply as a law enforcement strategy. The decision was made by identifiable officials. It was escalated over time as those officials watched the initial formula prove insufficient. It was defended, publicly and under oath, by men who acknowledged the deaths and described them as acceptable enforcement consequences. The people who died were disproportionately poor, immigrant, and black, the people least able to buy the safer product, least able to access legal remedy, and most likely to have their deaths misclassified or ignored. The policy continued unchanged through 12 years and the administrations of 4 presidents. Not one official was ever prosecuted or censured for it. And then it was buried, not in classified files, not in a secret directive. Buried in the mundane machinery of historical selection, in the accumulated preference for a prohibition story that features speakeasies and jazz rather than morgues and methanol. Buried in a federal register that no one reads. Buried in the comfortable narrative that says American governmental failures are always accidental, always well-intentioned, always the product of naivety rather than policy. The people who kept the record alive, Charles Norris, counting his dead and refusing to falsify his findings. Alexander Gettler, running his analyses and publishing his data in journals where it waited for 90 years. Senator James Reed, standing on the floor of the Senate and using the word murder and being voted down. Dr. Alice Hamilton, publishing her warnings and being ignored. Deborah Blum going to the archives, reading what was there, and deciding that its absence from the standard story was not acceptable. These are the people who make it possible to tell this story at all. They are the reason the record exists. They are the reason the record survived. What they understood and what the officials who opposed them did not understand or chose not to understand is this: the dead do not disappear because you choose not to count them. They stay in the ground, the documents stay in the archive, the chemistry stays in Gettler's case files. The congressional record stays in the congressional record. The truth of what happened is not a function of whether it is remembered. It is a function of whether it occurred. It occurred. History is not what happened. History is what we choose to remember, to teach, and to demand accountability for. The rest is what powerful people hope you forget. Don't forget. If this video reached you, share it, subscribe, leave a comment with the event that hit you hardest. Come back for the next one, because there are more.